All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending yet another episode of Outside of the Textbook. Um, we are here with Dr. Le-Tormala, and she's written this book called Postwar Journeys, American and Vietnam Transnational Peace Efforts since 1975. She was planning on visiting us in person, but she had some flights canceled as these things happen. So we were planning on having this podcast prior, and then she was going to do a presentation in one of our auditoriums here at campus, but that is not canceled, but we are just reverting for both mediums, both the presentation and this podcast on Zoom calls. So here we are. But this book analyzes the significant roles of private individuals in the post-war peace building initiatives through a study of post-war Vietnam and the impact of the war on millions of civilians. Dr. Le-Tormala provides a unique and potent perspective on the Vietnam War and its consequences. The text illuminates the extensive interactions between American and Vietnamese citizens amidst limited official diplomatic contact, focusing on their endeavors to resolve personal and societal challenges in the aftermaths of the conflict. Dr. Le-Tormala's research underscores the agency of ordinary citizens in cultivating cultural connections and fostering reciprocal understanding, particularly during periods of governmental animosity. Through various programs, individuals of diverse backgrounds served as intermediaries between the respective governments, facilitating the normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam. Post-war journeys demonstrates the empathy, shared experiences that united former adversaries and established a foundation for peace, potentially serving as a model for concerned American citizens regarding current and future conflicts precipitated by ill-conceived and evil government actions. A thorough examination of post-war journeys may indeed contribute to the prevention of future conflicts altogether. Dr. Le-Tormala is a distinguished scholar and educator. She currently serves as an adjunct instructor at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. She holds a PhD in history, which she earned from the University of Kansas. Her recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Scholarship is also worth noting, as it highlights her dedication to academia and to fostering cross-cultural understanding. So welcome, Dr. Le-Tormala. And before we get into the questions, I wanted to frame your thesis mainly for my own understanding. So correct me if I'm off basis here as we proceed into our conversation here. But you give Akria Aria credit, and correct me if I'm mispronouncing that name, for the research that went into your book, and you reference his book, Cultural Internationalism and World Order, as the source of your inspiration. And you highlight Aria's definition of, quote, cultural internationalism as one of peace, in which world order can and should be defined through interactions at the cultural level across national boundaries. You then add, and this is from the introduction, for him, viewing international relations through the cultural lens allows us to see beyond the geopolitical boundaries. And then you quote him, the world is created and recreated as much by individuals from lesser powers as by the greater powers. So after reading your book, what I gathered is that the balance of power between the greater and lesser powers is constantly shifting. It's almost like a dance. Lesser powers are driven by, and this is quoting you, universal human aspirations and emotions, which gradually gain influence and erode the dominance of greater powers. This transformation is often subtle and incremental, resembling the gradual erosion of a coastline, if you will. The universal human heart, and that's the way I kind of view what you're referring to as universal human aspirations and emotions, seems to provide lesser powers with legitimacy. and eventually the strength to challenge and perhaps at times diminish the authority of greater powers. As these aspirations and emotions resonate with the broader public and even those at times with political power, the balance of power gradually can shift in favor of the lesser powers. So what I found empowering about your thesis is that it offers a structure to what Dr. King described as the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice, which I find really instructive and again, empowering, because you hear that and it's like, yeah, well, sometimes, maybe not today. But, and sticking with Reverend here, just to further drive this point, you provide here a narrative for a type of power that Dr. King once described as power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love, correcting everything that stands against it. And to perhaps, wave by wave, build the long sought after beloved community that he sought after. And many activists, this is something I point to my students, whether we're talking about Mother Jones, Cesar Chavez, Alice Paul, that beloved community is piece by piece what they were trying to build. So Postwar Journeys quite simply offers us some of those waves that are eroding that coastline in the time period that you're capturing here from 1975 to the mid 90s for us to examine and to reflect on. So again, welcome. And we can get started with the questions. If there's anything there you would like to elaborate on or to correct or to further clarify, we could start there as well.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy, for your interest in my book. That is a wonderful introduction. And yes, I was very much inspired by Irie's theory and his call for looking at international relation, diplomatic history through a different lens. When we talk about international relations, we often talk about governmental interactions. But then when I look at the US and Vietnam post-war relations, I look at the surface and I saw governmental tensions, the lingering animosity from both sides, several times of failed attempts on both sides. Their attempt in negotiation for reconciliation was often disrupted. And so if we look at the period from 1975 to 1995, we don't see much there. But then underneath the surface, we saw the profound undercurrent, dynamic, creative, transnational border-crossing activities of these private citizens, the American people and the Vietnamese people, and more often than not, you would see them circumvent their laws, they circumvent their governments to work together, and their motivation was peace. And what brought these people together was their shared wartime experiences. Whether they were military personnel or they were civilians, that they had that shared wartime experiences. That is their suffering. It was their suffering, their negative emotions that brought them together. And they were motivated to transform those negative feelings, their negative emotions into active actions for themselves and for others, with the aspiration to create a different world.
Yeah, and indeed, yeah, your book really highlights that not everything was accomplished, but much too that was accomplished. And again, it really does come, it's a different mode of approaching the world. You have the political class that has their interest, which is, from my point of view, seems a lot motivated by personal ego. But when we're looking at the lesser powers of just rank and file people in the United States or in Vietnam, they're really coming at it from the heart. They're human connections, they're real human connections that is driving these political forces. I thought I would start off with a question, just basically asking about your personal background. I suspect that this research isn't just intellectual, but it's personal. So if there's anything you could say to that end, please do.
Yeah, so let me share with you a secret. Until 2002, I disliked history.
Oh, okay.
I was sent to the University of Kansas in 2002 on the Fulbright scholarship. And so by that time, I already got my first master degree in Vietnam, in TESOL, which is teaching English to speakers of other languages. And so when I went to KU, I majored in American Studies. And then in my very first semester, I looked at the course catalog and I saw a course entitled America in the 1960s. I looked at the course description and it mentioned the Vietnam War. So I was curious. So with all of the education I got in Vietnam, you could tell that I studied a lot about the history of Vietnam. But then from a very young age, I realized that the way history is taught and written in Vietnam is biased, because they use the language us versus them. And so that's why I was not interested in history. But then so when I look at that course title that mentioned the Vietnam War, I was curious what Americans think about the Vietnam War, because I grew up in post-war Vietnam. I did not have the American wartime experience. But I was 4 years old in 1975.
Okay.
And so, but I did have the experience of the post-war hardship. We grew up in extreme poverty, and the country were extremely poor anyway. But my family moved from Saigon to an economic zone by the border with Cambodia in 1975. So I mentioned the economic zone in the book. It was a policy of the new government in hope of recover and develop agricultural production and reduce the urban population because of unemployment. My family was not forced to go, but for some reason, I don't know, but my father volunteered to go. And so that's where my family went to the jungle, and my family did clear the jungle to build huts out of woods and grass. And then in the late 1970s, 1977, I did have the experience with the border conflict with Cambodia. Actually, my village, the new economic zone where we lived in, was one of the first villages that the Khmer Rouge attacked. And so we were refugees. So they literally came to my village and my elementary school was burned down. So I had 1 year off from school. So anyway, to make the long story short, I decided to take that course, American in the 1960s, taught by Professor Bill Tuttle. And I fell in love with history right away. And so in my class, he invited, when we reached the Vietnam War topic, he invited a veteran, John Musgrave, to come to my class as a guest speaker. That was the very first time I met an American veteran who fought in Vietnam. But his talk was very touching. I had tears in my eyes, and after that talk, I decided for my master thesis for this program, I got to do something about the American veterans. And then I was struggling on the approach on what to do about that topic, American veterans. And so I, quote unquote, discovered oral history. And so I decided to do an oral history project, and I interviewed 10 veterans, 10 combat veterans of the Vietnam War. So that was my master thesis at KU. And after that, so after I finished my studies, I returned to Vietnam in 2004. Then I got married. My husband is an American. And so he came to Vietnam to live for 3 years, and then we moved back. I come back to Lawrence as an immigrant. And so 2011, I decided to go back to school for a PhD in history. And there we go.
Excellent. Well, I'm very grateful to that professor that inspired you to pursue history. We're the benefactors of that. I thought, this is going to go out to students. So I thought just briefly, because you could spend probably the entirety of this podcast time talking about the Vietnam War, but if you could talk briefly about the factors that led to the Vietnam War, and then following up, I think even more important for our student audience is if you could talk about the magnitude of the Vietnam War and its repercussions on the Vietnamese population, enabling, just so our students can have a better understanding in the context of the post-war period.
Okay. So would you like me to, I'm sorry, the first part of the question, would you like me to talk about the context that led to the Vietnam War?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so just a brief history of Vietnam. Vietnam has a long history of fighting against foreign invasion by the Chinese, and then Vietnam, for thousands of years, off and on, Vietnam was colonized and then got independence from China, and then in the 1860s, Vietnam was colonized by France. And then in 1945, Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of the nationalist movement, declared independence of Vietnam in 1945. That was when he took the chance that France failed in World War II. And also Japan was defeated by the United States in 1945. Now, during World War II, Japan also occupied Vietnam. So during World War II, Vietnam was occupied by two colonizers. The French were still there. The Japanese jumped in. And so the nationalist movement grew stronger. And so in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared independence of Vietnam, but the World War II ended, and the French decided that they want to come back to protect their colony. And so in the context of the Cold War that picked up its momentum after World War II, the United States was concerned about the spread of communism. They were concerned about the domino theory, that if Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh was a communist, he was at heart, I believe, a nationalist, but he found that communism promised something, because communism talked about decolonization. He found the promise there, and he got help. He was promised help from Russia. And so that's why he leaned toward Russia. He also sought help from the United States, but President Woodrow Wilson just ignored him because he was nobody at the end of World War I. Anyway, so the French in 1945 decided to come back, and amid the atmosphere of the Cold War and the strong belief of the domino theory among US politicians, the French diplomat did present the problem to the US government. And I quote this from the book, Embers of War. The French said to the United States, the French diplomat said to the United States that if you do not help us fight communism in Vietnam now, one day you would have to fight communism on your own soil. And so the US politician agreed to help France. The US sponsored the war, the first Indochina War, which is the war between the Vietnamese nationalists and the French from 1945 to 1954. And so in 1954, the Geneva Peace Accord was signed, temporarily divide Vietnam by the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh controlled North Vietnam. And in the south, Ngô Đình Diệm was became president. Ngô Đình Diệm was backed up by the United States. Ngô Đình Diệm and people of South Vietnam did not want to join the communist North. But both sides, both North and South Vietnam, wanted to unify the country. But they disagree on whether the country would become communist or not. And so that's when the United States, so the French was defeated in 1954. They were out. And then the United States could not let Vietnam to become a communist country. That's why and how the US started to intervene.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and I suspect that, the communist movement within Vietnam was motivated by colonization itself, right? The long-held colonization, particularly the France.
Yes.
And I think that's often lost on people who aren't familiar with what colonization means and empires mean, but literally the resources of the land are being sucked out by another country. And so, yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that Ho Chi Minh was more motivated as a nationalist and using communism perhaps as a tool to help the Vietnamese people regain the actual wealth in their land through programs like land distribution and whatnot, which was heavily
I would
intervened
like to
by.
add one interesting detail
Sure.
that Ho Chi Minh actually really admired the U.S. democratic ideals. He appealed to Woodrow Wilson, and he actually quoted and translated the statement from the United States Declaration of Independence and put it in the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suspect President Woodrow Wilson's prejudices, his ideas of race, kind of precluded him from ever taking someone like Ho Chi Minh seriously, unfortunately. Yeah, and if you could talk a little bit just about the tragic repercussions, I think most students, just Americans in general, hear about how a lot of American soldiers died, and they hear a little bit about how the Vietnamese might have suffered and died, but I don't think we've heard the suffering entailed in the at least 10 years of active combat the United States engaged in with Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, so when the war ended in 1975, we, as I mentioned, the entire country suffered from economic hardship. And many people, whether not fully understand the picture or simplify the picture and blame that on the new communist government. Yes, there was some policy by the communist government that did not help. They were poorly designed and poorly conducted. Yes, that happened. But at the same time, if we look further, we would see a collapse of an unsustainable economy that relied on the United States financial support and the war machine. So from 1961 to 1975, the US spent about $141 billion on South Vietnam. And very little of that amount was spent on economic development. And so they were, because warfare was going on, there was not many economic developments. And we also saw, because of warfare, there was the dislocation of people from rural areas. The bombing mostly happened in rural areas and small towns. And we saw that dislocation, the mass migration to urban areas. So that dislocation caused two problems: the disruption for agricultural production and unemployment rate in urban areas, and other problems in urban areas as well. And for the economy in urban areas, they largely depend on the service sector because of the presence of the US personnel there. And also they depended on imported goods, most foodstuff and the consumer goods were imported.
Okay.
So in 1975, the US withdrew altogether. So all of that was gone. All the money was gone. All the imports were gone. All the jobs in the service sector were gone. And then now what we were left was the, we tried to recover agricultural reproduction, but you would see the changed landscape because of warfare. You would see bomb craters everywhere, unexploded ordnance. In that new economic zone that my family moved to, bomb craters were literally everywhere. The main road in our town was about the size of the width of a classroom, but we often had to go zigzag to avoid bomb craters. And in the rainy season, those bomb craters of all sizes became ponds of water, full of water. And in those years, from 1975 until 1980, before my family moved to another town, it was common for us to hear explosion in the village. Somebody was working on their farm and accidentally hit an unexploded bomb or mine. And we had civilian casualties in that village on a daily basis. I was too young to be scared, and I would run over to my neighbors and look at those people that were injured. They were my neighbors and friends. And so that was the reality of the post-war period. And also Agent Orange, the defoliant chemical that was used by the US to clear the jungles, to find the enemies. It's destroy the landscape. And also because it's a powder, so the wind would carry it miles away. And so, and the chemicals stay in the soil and contaminated the soil for decades. All the beings, the vegetation and the animals that depends on the water source on the soil would be affected. And actually, Agent Orange caused immediate health problems to those who are exposed to it. And it also caused health problems to the third generation. It caused birth defects in the third generation of Vietnamese people.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, basically the United States just creates this big mess, leaves, and the Vietnamese people are left to deal with the legacy of unexploded munitions, Agent Orange. I also took note of just what a mess it is that a lot of rural areas are bombed, so the agricultural base is destroyed, and then those people are moving to urban areas, complicating just the general problems that come with urban areas. So yeah, we're talking about a very tragic time period for people living in Vietnam during this time period. Okay, could you please explain how Iria's concept of cultural interpretation and cultural nationalism, or cultural interpretation and cultural nationalism relate to and diverge from the perspectives and actions of the US government and the citizens after the war? And then please provide specific examples of religious and civic organizations that exemplify each concept to illustrate your thesis.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, as we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the conversation, yeah, so Urias use the term cultural interpretation. That means we would look at the human history through the cultural lens instead of the geopolitical lens. When we look at the geopolitical lens, we look at the boundaries, we focus more on the differences. And we look we look at history through the cultural lens. We would focus more on the similarities among people. And the phrase that he used is the universal inspiration, aspiration, and emotions. Yeah. And so So if we focus on more on similarities, we find that when we find we have more common, we would focus more on love and sustainable peace. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at human relations. He also distinguished, I would like to clarify the differences between the two terms, cultural internationalism and cultural transnationalism. So cultural internationalism, as defined by Iroye, is the cooperation among nations. Governments work together for international policy that promote political, economic, and cultural developments. And he uses UNESCO as an example of cultural internationalism. Then we have cultural transnationalism. And cultural nationalism is defined as the collaboration among non-state actors, private citizens. So, and he also pointed out that cultural internationalism and cultural transnationalism may intersect, where you have private citizens interact with government agencies as well. And so my book explored the relations between the US and Vietnam through the cultural lens, through the lens of cultural transnationalism. Although in some cases, they did intersect with the governments. And I would like to give a few examples. The French shipment, for example, the French shipment was an umbrella that consists about 30 to 40 judges and civic groups. And they started humanitarian aid to Vietnam immediately after the war ended. The war ended in April 1975. They started in May 1975. So they started by donating blankets, children clothes, antibiotics, and farming tools to Vietnam. And between May 1975 to May 1976, within 1 year, they provided humanitarian aid to Vietnam worth of $1.34 million. That was an amazing effort. And of course, there was absolutely no governmental negotiation between Vietnam and the US during that time, during that very first 1 year. And traveling to Vietnam was extremely difficult. They could not get a visa because there was no government relations. There was no embassies in either country. People had to go to a third country to apply for a visa to go to Vietnam. In 1976, the religious leaders of the churches under French shipment visited Vietnam, and upon their return to the United States, they urged the United States to lift the economic embargo on Vietnam, to normalize relations with Vietnam, and to provide reconstruction aid for post-war. And so their activities focused not only on humanitarian aid, but they were also trying to push the government to improve their relations, to put the past behind. In March 1977, they raised about $150,000 to build the My Lai Hospital on the site where the My Lai massacre happened. So I think that particular example is very powerful. The idea of building a hospital on the site of a massacre symbolizes a profound transformation from something that was very brutal, the utmost brutal of human activities, to a symbol of healing, literal and figurative healing for the people that suffer so much. And that was speaking a lot to the governments on both sides. And what we are seeing, what we are focusing on, we are not seeing the differences in politics. We're not seeing communists or capitalism. We are not seeing enemies here. We are seeing the suffering of other human beings. And this is what we need to do. Another example is the Church War Service. Church War Service was established in 1946. They started to come to Vietnam with for humanitarian aid in 1954 at the end of the First Indochina War. And they continued the activity throughout the time of the US involvement in Vietnam. And then in 1976, they resumed their activity in Vietnam. So the activity was paused from 1975 to 1976. They resumed in 76. And between 1976 and 1990, they provided emergency relief funds to Vietnam worth of about $8 million. All of those humanitarian aid was very much needed in Vietnam because Vietnam was suffering from the trade embargo by the United States. Basically, Vietnam could not trade with other countries. Vietnam could not get loans from the World Bank or the IMF. And so there was very limited things that Vietnam could do to recover its economy, to address the immediate need of the people.
Yeah, and to clarify to perhaps any student that might not be familiar with the My Lai massacre, this was, I believe, in 1968. It's a very horrific event where US soldiers massacred anywhere from 350 to, I believe, 500 civilians, men, women, and children. It served as a turning point, in part, towards the American people to begin to organize against the war. So indeed, ordinary rank and file American citizens after the war raising funds to establish a hospital there is absolutely both symbolic and quite literal as far as healing is concerned between the two countries. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Sort of to flesh out your thesis here and to expand on what you were just talking about, what came to mind as I was reading this book is this is a counter to Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State during the Vietnam War, kind of the architect of the war. And he had a thesis, basically history, writ large about history. History is the memory of the state, which basically posits a statement that neglects substantive influence of just human beings involved in history and just focuses on state leaders, presidents, kings, diplomats, whatever, and completely discounts the role of an average citizen who is also moving history. So could you kindly elaborate on how your research elucidates the manner in which government actions often deviate from and subsequently mirror the concerns and the exegesis of the citizenry?
Yes, thank you. Kissinger's statement that history is the memory of the state, and so we know pretty well that what kind of story that you hear depends on who is telling the story, right? And so if we tell the story from the state perspective, we do miss a very large pictures there by the ordinary citizens. So an example, to counter that statement is that the refugees, the boat people. And if we look at it from the surface, these refugees are seemingly powerless. And they, if you look at their situation, they wanted, for a number of reasons, that they wanted to leave the country. They want to live elsewhere. Their homeland became unlivable for them. So they had to go somewhere. And so they make that decision, those spontaneous individual decision developed into such a large scale that they were able to get international attention. And they were able to push governments to work together, not just the Vietnamese government, the US government, but other international governments to work together. The UN, the United Nations, had to create an emergency session because of the refugee phenomenon, because of the boat people phenomenon. So, and we see, and from then we would see policy change. Now we would see with government would have to work together. The Vietnamese government had to change its policy to prevent people from leaving. The US government had to change its policy to admit refugees to the country. The asylum country, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, etc., those countries in Asia, where they admitted, where these boat people landed temporarily, they also had to change their policy. They had to put up the refugee camps to help these people. And so we would see government cooperation, policy change in these countries. And actually, it was President Carter that requested the UN to convene an emergency session in 1979 to address the emergency. And Congress and the White House work around the clock because of this situation. And there are documents, there are memos between the White House and Congress that were stamped immediate turnaround. And so what I am seeing is that these people were pushing governmental officials to work harder to solve their problems. And to make the long story short, in 1979, we have the Orderly Departure Program initiated by the United States. So with that program, again, governments work together to let these people, those who wish to leave the country orderly, and not risking their lives in the Pacific Ocean. Another example of the seemingly powerless people that pushed government to work were the Amerasians. For those who are not familiar with the term, Amerasians refer to children of the Vietnamese women fathered by US personnel. And so in 1980, journalist Bill Curtis and his team members from the Chicago TV station, visited Vietnam just to see the country 5 years after the war. And they just noticed these Western, the children in the street of Vietnam that look like Americans. And so they saw that as a phenomenon. And also during their time in Vietnam, many of those children, many of those Vietnamese people that look like American approached them, tried to make contact with these journalists. And these people had very little knowledge. All they knew is that they guessed that these are Americans. They spoke little English. And they would give these people their personal information, their address, their date of birth, the name of the father. They thought They knew too little. They thought that these people could help them find their American father. And they sent hundreds of notes to these journalists, and the journalists were approached by a Vietnamese government official. These American journalists were demanded to turn in the notes or the letters or the information from the Vietnamese people. And so these journalists had to have a secret meeting in their hotel room, and they decided that they are not turning these people in because that there are identifiable information from these Vietnamese people, and they would not know what might happen to them if they turn them in. And so they decided that they were going to take photos of these images, of these notes and letters. And they turn in just a few, just a couple, without identifiable information of these Vietnamese people to the Vietnamese government official. And the rest of them, they secretly brought it to a third country embassy, told them the story, and then asked them to, because they could not bring those out of the United States. So they have this third country, which is still in secret, to keep them and to send them to the US embassy later. And when these journalists returned home, they published the stories about these Amerasians. And these stories caught the public attention in the United States. And that prompted the American people to act, to push for the government to bring these quote unquote American children home. And so in 1992, the Amerasian Act was issued. And so that Amerasian Act would allow Amerasians to go to the United States, to immigrate to the United States as refugees. But because of the large number of Amerasians and the obstacles caused by no governmental relations, like no failed negotiation between the two countries, the immigration process for the Amerasian were very slow, and thousands of them were still stuck in Vietnam. And then in 1985, a photojournalist visited Vietnam. That is Audrey Tiernan. And when she was on the street of Saigon, she encountered an Amerasian who was unable to walk because of his disabilities, and he made her something, I think, and a flower or a bird from the silver lining of a cigarette packet. He gave it to her, and in his broken English, he told her that his father was American. And so the photojournalist Tiernan came back to the United States, published the story with the image of this Amerasian with disability as a beggar in the street of Saigon. And that story caught the attention of 4 high school students of Huntington High School in Long Island, New York. These 4 high school students gather signature. They gather 27,000 signatures. And they presented the story to their Congressman Robert Brazak to push the government to do something to bring that boy himself, Levin Min, to the United States for medical treatment.
Wow.
And so Brazak were touched by the students' initiative, and he worked and successfully were able to bring Levin Min, and he himself went to Vietnam to bring Levin Min himself to the United States for medical treatment. And also, after that, he did not stop there. Brazak continued to push on a new policy for Amerasians to make it easier for them to immigrate to the United States. And as a result, he was he was the person who proposed the Amerasian Homecoming Act, which were passed in 1987.
It was
And
1987.
yes. And so the Amerasian Act of 1982 only allowed Amerasians themselves to come to the United States as refugees. The Amerasian Homecoming Act of 1987 allowed not only Amerasians, but also their spouse, their children, their mother or guardian to come to the United States as immigrants and not refugees.
Which seems fitting. I mean, if you're allowed to come to the United States, you're not going to go by yourself and abandon your family. So,
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
that was a dilemma
a
for
huge
many.
dilemma. Yeah. Well, that's a very powerful story. I mean, just the fact that high school students inspired a congressman by gathering 27,000 signatures for him to take a look at this. For at first one individual, and the more he looked into it, he said he discovered it sounded like a broader problem and issue. So that truly is amazing. That really does undercut this idea that if you want to understand history, you just need to understand what presidents and diplomats and kings and generals were up to, right? That's really just the surface level of history. So thank you for those examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, just could you talk about just the numbers though of refugees? What are we talking about as far as how many people are trying to flee Vietnam immediately following the war?
Oh, I blanked my mind now.
No problem. Yeah, nothing specific, but are we talking about in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands?
Yeah, I would say several dozens of thousands.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this, and it's undeniable. People are noticing this. The press, governments are noticing. It has an impact on neighboring countries. So,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, on the issue of on the topic of Amerasians, can you detail primary motivations that drove Vietnamese citizens to immigrate from their native country, and elucidate on the significant hardships speaking of Amerasians in Vietnam and their subsequent endeavors to reconnect with their American paternal figures?
Yeah. So the Amerasians were I would say an unfortunate byproduct of war. And they were very unfortunately, they were unwanted by both sides, both the Americans and the Vietnamese. In post-war Vietnam, Amerasians were viewed. So I categorized their suffering into three things: political issues, social issues, and cultural issues. And so politically, they were viewed as the children of the enemy. They were believed that their mother were collaborating with the Americans, and therefore they were betrayal. They were betraying Vietnam. And so they were not wanted politically because they were children of the enemy. Now, socially, Vietnam back then and largely until today still do not recognize or at least frown upon children born out of wedlock. Now, it is worth mentioning that some of those Amerasians were not born out of wedlock. Their parents were married. But because of the end of the war, because when their father finished the tour in Vietnam and they left Vietnam, the absence of their father, for whatever reason, would put them in that same situation as other children that do not have father. So children without father were considered as bastards, unacceptable in the society. And so they were the the most horrendous thing was that, first of all, they suffer from their own family treatment. They were disowned by their family. The mother and the children would be disowned by their family. And culturally, Vietnamese people, at least at that time, still had xenophobia. Because they were not, so they believe in that kind of racial purity, which is racism. And they do not, they view children that have a different appearance, they view people with a different appearance as misfit in the societies. So these Amerasians suffered from racism, from the social norms of that children have to have fathers, children have to be born officially out of a marriage. And so they were unwanted. They were badly treated, both in the family and then in the society. Children would be bullied at school. They would be bullied in the society. And because of all those circumstances, their mother often fell into poverty because they could not find a job. They could not get help. Some could not even go to school. So they were the outcast of the society.
Thank you. It helps explain the motivation of why they advocated for themselves greatly there. Your book really focuses on NGOs, non-government organizations dedicated to fostering reconciliation and normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam. And one of the ones I found really inspiring were the Peace Trees Vietnam NGO. That particularly resonated with me. Could you elaborate on this organization and its specific contributions to normalizing relations?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, Peace Tree is actually a very inspiring organization. The story started with a young man, Daniel Jenny. He was sent to Vietnam in 1968. And on January 6, 1969, only after several months in Vietnam, he was killed. On the same day, the announcement of his engagement were published on a Bellingham newspaper. But the news of his death would arrive much later. But those things happened on the same day. And so he was killed 3 weeks short of his 22nd birthday. His mother and his sister suffered profoundly. And so his sister, Geraldine Shani Russell, was trying to find a way to alleviate the pain, the suffering for the mother. And so in 1988, she and her husband, Dan Perry, created the Peace Trees program. That program started as an organization to plant trees in former war zone areas around the world. In Africa, for example. But because of the frozen diplomatic relation between the US and Vietnam, they could not go to Vietnam at that time. It was too hard for them to find a way to go to Vietnam at that time. And so, what they did was they would go to those former war zone and ask young people in the village to plant trees to transform the landscape and to restore the environment. And then in 1995, 7 years later, when Geraldine and her husband learned about the diplomatic normalization with Vietnam. And so they were excited, and now they officially could bring history to Vietnam. And so they started immediately in 1995. And let me look at some statistics here. Until 2011, sorry, until 2015. Now, let me back up a little bit. In order to plant trees in Vietnam, and they chose Quảng Trị, a province in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which suffered a heavy bomb tonnage, and also the very high amount of unexploded ordnance remained there until today. It was much worse in the 1990s. There were still daily civilian casualty in the 1990s. And in order to change the landscape of Quảng Trị, they had to first clear the mines. And so they were able to, until 2015, they were able to clear 85,900 unexploded ordnance in an area of 800 acres of land. And they brought to Vietnam 700 volunteers. Beside planting trees, they also provided emergency relief to the victims of unexploded ordnance. So they were able to help 950 victims of unexploded ordnance. They built 10 kindergartens, 12 libraries, and 2 community centers. One of the community centers was the Friendship Village, which consists of 100 homes for the people that were living in an area contaminated with unexploded bombs and landmines. And so they had to relocate these people to the village, to the newly built village, to clear the mines and bombs in that area to plant trees. So their work was incredible. So they not only helped with war victims, they also helped with educating people about the information about the danger of the unexploded ordnance, to teach kids not to kick a strange object in their backyard or in the field, or to report it if they see a strange object, and how to ask for help. So that kind of education was much needed, because the majority of the accident happened was kids playing, kicking things around in the backyard, and people tilling their land, plow the soil and hit a landmine or an exploded bomb. One note about the Peace Tree organization is that the mother Ray Cheney, mother of Lieutenant Daniel Cheney, for a long time she held animosity against Vietnam. Of course, it's understandable because her son was killed in Vietnam. But when her daughter told her that she needed some volunteers to write thank you letters to donors, Mother Ray Cheney volunteer. Until 2015, she wrote about 8,000 letters, 8,000 thank you letters to donors. And so she stated that in the process of writing the thank you letters to the donors for the projects in Vietnam, she started to feel healed. She felt connected with the other victims of war in Vietnam. She felt that her son was not alone. She was not alone. She was not the only mother that was suffering from the loss of her child because of war. She felt very connected. And then in 2010, she decided to visit Vietnam in her 90s. And there she met with a Vietnamese mothers who lost 2 sons in the same village where her son was killed. And the 2 mothers hugs and cries and share their loss. And so here again, you see that Aries phrase, the universal emotions and aspirations. That's what we have in common. They do not care what is communism. They do not care what side you are on. The mother that lost a child have the same emotions, no matter where they come from, no matter what their background is.
Mhm.
And so the Peace Tree organization did a lot in their effort to heal the wounds of war, literally to heal the land, to heal the people as well. And by restoring the environment, by changing the landscape of war, turning the war landscape into something that is peaceful, that is better for the future. It's symbolized a lot of hope there for the world.
Yeah. There were times in this book, this is an academic book. It's giving a lot of history, a lot of statistics, a lot of dates, a lot of individuals, and you can learn just this piece of history. But if you're paying attention, there's a deep spiritual component to this history. And what you just highlighted is, I think, at the heart of what we mean by spiritual, not in a new age sense, but in a real sense of people connecting over something. I think even if you haven't experienced it, anybody can relate to what it must feel, the pain that must endure to losing a child, let alone losing a child in an act of war. So yeah, thank you for providing those examples there.
Thank you.
Let's see. You talk a lot about the role of let's see. Let me make sure of poetry in this book here. To highlight universal human aspirations and emotions, as well as its ability to bring solace to those affected by the conflict in America and Vietnam. Specifically, I would appreciate any explanation of John Balaban's contributions in this regard.
Yeah, the story of John Balaban is something else really mind-blowing. So just a few words about the background. John Balaban was a conscientious objector of the Vietnam War. But he had this idea that, well, he protested the war, but he didn't want to be perceived as someone who protested the war, not wanting to go to Vietnam because he didn't want to fight because he was a coward. So he decided to volunteer to go to Vietnam to teach English. He was a major in English. So he wanted to teach English at a university in the Mekong Delta. And the Mekong Delta suffer a lot from the military confrontation. And so after a few months in Vietnam, so his going to Vietnam was different from other people. So he went as a volunteer, as an English teacher at a university. So he was living among civilians. He rented a room, living with a Vietnamese family. And so he had a chance to understand the Vietnamese culture. In all fairness, he had the opportunity that other American soldiers would not have. The American soldiers, excuse me, the American soldiers did not have an opportunity to make friends with the Vietnamese. Some did, but very few. They did not have an opportunity to see Vietnamese people as a people with a culture, the people with a soul. To see the Vietnamese, to actually understand them and to appreciate their culture. A few months after he was in Vietnam, the university that he taught at was bombed. And so his teaching job he was also injured. So his teaching job was interrupted. He went back to the United States. But as soon as he was recovered, he wanted to go back to Vietnam. And there is a specific reason, because during his few months in Vietnam the first time, he noticed that folk poetry was very popular in Vietnam. And indeed, it is very popular. I think every Vietnamese person would know at least a few folk poems. In my time, when I was growing up, my generation, we were sung into sleep by our parents with folk poetry. That happens in every family. And so he noticed that, and he was also learning Vietnamese, so he came to appreciate the Vietnamese folk poetry. He was interested in them. And the folk poetry, the Vietnamese folk poetry are fascinating because they use a lot of analogies. The way they express love and emotion at a deep level in a very subtle way. It is fascinating. And so John Balaban decided to go back to Vietnam to collect folk poetry. And because everybody knew them, but there were no written collection of folk poetry at that time in the 1970s, the 60s, the 70s. So John Balaban decided to do that, and he came back, and he would carry a Walkman recorder, walking the villages in rural Vietnam, knocking on every house that he encountered. And what he did was well, actually not knocking on the door, because most people would have their doors open. They would come to each house and ask whoever answered the door, whoever see him first, to sing or to read their favorite folk poem. And everybody would, and he would record it. And in some of his recordings, you could hear gunfire in the background in the recording. And so he translated those folk poems into English to introduce the Vietnamese culture to the Americans.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'm sorry. So
yeah,
another note that
sure,
was
yeah,
not.
thank you.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, continue. Sorry.
That was not the only contribution of John Balaban to collect and translate Vietnamese folk poetry. Another thing he did was to he learned about the Vietnamese ancient script. So the script that we use today is Romanized by Alexander wrote for Christian missionary purposes in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. Our ancient script looks similar to the Chinese script, but they are different. And by the 1970s, there were only a few dozens of Vietnamese people that were literate, that could read the Vietnamese ancient script. And so John Balaban found that was a huge loss for the Vietnamese culture. And also with his love for the Vietnamese literature, he quote unquote discovered a woman poet of the 15th, 16th century. And she was a prominent woman who wrote witty poems against sexism, classism, feudalism. Basically, she was a woman who raised her voices against the powers of the time. And so her poems were translated into our modern language, but few people could truly read her original poems. And so because of his love for her poem, he wanted to help recover the Vietnamese ancient transcript. And so he created a fund, an organization, and then a fund recruiting researchers, scientists from and linguists from Vietnam and from the United States to computerize the writing system for that ancient script system. And his foundation also provides scholarship to those who want to learn that language.
Yeah, and do I recall from your book that in the 1920s, the French had outlawed publications of Vietnamese folk poetry? Or am I confusing that with something else?
No, I did not have
Okay.
that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what a fascinating character. I mean, just he's and so if I'm getting you straight, this guy literally is going to Vietnam during the war to teach. Okay, yeah, this is a unique individual. I would like to learn more about him. You conclude this book by offering the reader a powerful poem that goes as follows. I suppose that at first it was people who invented borders, and then borders started to invent people. It was borders who invented police, armies, and border guards. While borders still stand, we are all in prehistory. Real history will start when all borders are gone. So, what is the distinction being made here between pre and real history? And what events in your book point to pre and history, and what events point towards real history? Do you suppose?
Wow, that is a a great question, and I cannot guarantee if I could if I would actually answer your question, but I would say what I think.
Yeah, and I'll just throw this out here too, because this is kind of flips our idea of history on its head, because we kind of think of prehistory as kind of kinship, tribal history before literate history, and he's basically saying no, that's all. And what real history is what follows civilization, borders, wars, culture itself that comes out of civilization. And he's arguing in this poem that no, that's all prehistory. We're still waiting for real history. And so, and I think, and what I'm reading in your book, just ordinary individuals taking time out of their lives to heal themselves, or just motivated by just wanting to do the right thing, are I suppose are engaging in what the poet would refer to as real history.
So I from my interpretation of the poem, I take it that he viewed prehistory as the history created by borders, and borders means boundaries. When we talk about borders and boundaries, we talk about national interests. We talk about political tensions, and when we talk about those things, we focus on differences. And therefore, when we focus on the differences, we refuse to see other people as they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so that by doing that, we limit our worldview. We do not see the real thing. We do not see people as they are, but we see people as how they fit or not fit in our lens. If they don't fit, then they are the enemy. And so that is just the surface. I think the poet refers to that is the surface. That is not the real history, because we do not see the real world as it is. And on the other side, we have, he said, the real history. And I think that is when we transcend boundaries, when we remove boundaries, when we are willing to open our eyes and to see things as they are, when we focus more on our similarities rather than the differences. When we focus on similarity, I would go back to Area. We would be able to see the universal emotions and aspirations. no matter where you come from, no matter what background you have, no matter what time you live in, all human beings, or we basically have the same, share the same needs, and we have the same emotions. So we don't see, if we look at that, we don't see boundaries there. And that's what really happened. And we really need to look into that to understand the world and not just to focus on the differences.
Yeah.
And so in my book, I think, because I'm looking at the non-state actors that cross the boundaries. So if you look at these people, whether they are NGOs or individuals or veterans, they don't see the borders. All that they see, and in their argument, in their advocacy, and their letters sent to the government, all they see is the needs of the other human beings that we need to address. We don't see politics. We don't see national interest here. We don't see the differences. And so that's what they do. And that was what was actually going on. Again, we go back to my thesis that on the surface, we look at the frozen diplomatic relations. There's not much to talk about there. From 1975 to 1995.
Exactly.
Yeah, but underneath, you see a lot is going on. So that is what is actually going on. And that is real history, I think.
Yeah, because I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of a history student just taking a class because you have to, it's part of the core. You're reading, okay, the war's over in 1975, you turn the page. Oh, relations are normalized in 1994. Okay, interesting. I'll make sure I study that. But what gets lost in between is, was the subject of your book. Yeah. Um, we're running short on time, but I want to give you the opportunity to basically address any question that you wished I had asked within your book.
Yeah, so we have just a few minutes, but
Yeah.
so we mentioned a little bit about the governmental tensions between Vietnam and the United States for the 20 years before normalization. So I wonder, maybe some people might ask, what caused the frozen diplomatic relation to be so long? Because it was very different. If you look at the other wars that the United States participated in, the post-war relation was not like that. And I would like to, according to numerous historians, it was so because the US government was bitter because of how the war ended. It was the first war that the United States was defeated, and they were bitter. And we would see evidence of the US government being double standard, and yet again stood on the wrong side of history. Why trying to have to normalize relation with Vietnam, and what happened involved Cambodia. Cambodia's the Cambodia issue occurred as a roadblock to the normalization between the US and Vietnam. What happened was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the mid-1970s conducted an auto-genocidal regime. So within 5-6 years in the 1970s, they murdered about a quarter of their own population. It was the idea by Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge. He wanted to start the Cambodian society anew with newborn children, so he could mold them the way he wanted to. And his number one enemy was the intellectuals. Among the intellectuals were teachers. The number one among intellectuals were teachers, because he believed that, he knew that it was hard to change intellectuals and teachers. And so they murder people brutally. And they, not only that they murdered their own people, they crossed, as I mentioned earlier, they crossed the border to Vietnam. And my village was one of those first villages that were attacked. And that village that was about 7-8 miles from my house at that time, within a few hours, they murdered almost 600 people. And so they crossed the border. And so Vietnam had to react naturally, right, for national defense. So Vietnam would push them back across the border, and they would sort of back and forth over the border issues, and then Vietnam, the Vietnamese military were able to defeat the Khmer Rouge, to overthrow the Khmer Rouge. But the United States blamed Vietnam for the invasion of Cambodia. So the United States accused Vietnam of the invasion of Cambodia, of invading an independent country, totally ignoring the fact that the Khmer Rouge invaded Vietnam first. Totally ignoring the fact that the Khmer Rouge was a genocidal regime. And even after Vietnam helped establish a new government in Cambodia, because that Cambodian government was backed up by the Vietnamese government to ensure that they are not supporting the Khmer Rouge. The US would not accept that new government in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge now would find sanctuary in an area in Cambodia that has border with Thailand. And so Thailand at that time was also assisted the Khmer Rouge. Thailand was nursing them back into power. China was also supporting the Khmer Rouge. Thailand and China was doing so in an attempt to seek alliance with the United States. The United States, in the Cold War atmosphere, wanted to improve its relation with China. And so supported, or at least ignore, the fact that China was helping the Khmer Rouge. There was evidence, Congress memos and congressional hearings provided plenty evidence that the US governments were very well aware of what the Khmer Rouge were doing, and still accused Vietnam of that invasion. And in the peace settlement for Cambodia, the US insisted that they have to include the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge actually got a seat in the UN, while Vietnam was voted against twice for membership in the UN. And so in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the US made a condition that Vietnam had to withdraw from Cambodia in order to normalize its relation with the United States. But everybody knew very well that if Vietnam withdrew its military from Cambodia, it is likely that the Khmer Rouge would come back to power. So that was that finding was shocking to me, that the US stood on the wrong side of history despite all the evidence, all the information that they knew about the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this: the Vietnamese are a very resilient people. I mean, we're talking 1,000 years under Chinese oppression, the French, the Americans, Cambodia, the United States acting in bad faith. It's a testament, something very strong within the culture of Vietnam. I'm just trying to project myself into the situation at any given time, the post-war period, the war itself. And I don't know, I think a reasonable reaction would just be madness. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. I mean, we did get up to a lot of this book, but we, in many ways, just scratched the surface of this book. But anybody happening to view this book, I would highly recommend picking up a copy of this. There's a lot to learn, you know, particularly with just the time period itself. But I think it does point us to a snapshot of some things that are very inherent to just being a human being on this planet, despite some of the madness that we are compelled to deal with. Um, and and I think, you know, given the times that we're faced with now, there's lots of uncertainty going on. I think this can prove to be a template um, for us going forward, particularly here in the United States, with this increasingly dysfunctional government of keeping in mind that we're not a disempowered people at the whims of powerful people who have their own self-interest in mind. Um, if we just rely on our hearts and rely on human connection as our strength to get us through whatever might endure in the future. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk. And I look forward to your talk, your presentation that's going to happen in about an hour. So I don't want to keep you any longer further. So I'm sure you need a little bit of rest and maybe some lunch. But thank you very much. And I'm also really sorry that we're not going to have a lunch together or dinner
Okay.
together. I was going to bring my wife and everything. It was going to be a lot of fun, but maybe another time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. You have a good afternoon and good evening.
Thank you. Bye bye.